On the morning of January 14th, 1895, when 36 degrees below zero froze cattle solid where they stood in Deer Lodge Valley, a 24-year-old ranch hand woke up in his shirt sleeves, took a sip of liquid water from his tin cup, and looked at a wall thermometer that read 63 degrees Fahrenheit. He had not added a single stick of wood to his fire since 9 o'clock the previous night. To understand how that was possible, you have to go back to late October of 1894, when the autumn air in western Montana Territory turned sharp enough to slice your lungs, and frost coated the tall prairie grass like crushed glass every dawn. Arthur Vance stood in the center of his late father's log cabin, watching his own breath bloom in white clouds just 5 feet away from a roaring fireplace. His father, a hard-working homesteading rancher who had spent 30 years breaking the western soil, had passed away the previous February. He had not died from a horse fall or an infected wound, but from a deep, rattling chest pneumonia brought on by months of sleeping in a room where the temperature dropped below freezing every time the hearth fire died down to embers. Grief has a way of making a man pay fierce, methodical attention to things he used to take for granted. Standing there in the chill of late October, Arthur did not just see a crackling fire. He saw a fundamental flaw in the way frontier homes were built. Every log cabin in the valley was constructed around a massive stone or brick fireplace set right into an exterior wall. It was the standard way. It was the way the early trappers built, the way the Oregon Trail settlers built, and the way every master carpenter from Missouri to the Pacific Ocean insisted a cabin had to be made. But Arthur had spent the long, lonely evenings of the previous winter reading through a crate of dusty engineering journals and physical science manuals that his mother had ordered from Philadelphia years ago. And as he studied the flickering flames of his hearth, he realized something that made his blood run cold. The traditional frontier fireplace was not actually heating the house. In fact, it was actively stealing heat from the people inside it. Here is the physical reality of what was happening, explained in plain terms. When you build a large open fireplace on an outer wall and light a roaring fire, the hot air rises rapidly straight up the chimney flue. That rapid upward movement creates a powerful draft. But air is a fluid, and when a large volume of hot air is violently pumped out of a room through the chimney, the room experiences a sharp drop in air pressure. Nature despises a vacuum. To balance that pressure difference, the house has to pull air in from somewhere else. Where does that air come from? It gets sucked right through the tiny gaps in the log wall chinking, through the spaces around the door frame, and through the cracks in the floorboards. The bigger and hotter you build your fireplace fire, the faster it pumps warm air out the roof, and the harder it pulls sub-zero outdoor air inward through every seam in your walls. Engineers call this the stack effect, but to a family sleeping in a Montana cabin, it meant one simple, brutal truth. Your chest might be warm if you stood 3 feet from the hearth, but your back was freezing, and the far corners of your room were constantly being flooded with icy draft air drawn directly from the wilderness outside. Arthur remembered his father sitting by that very hearth the winter before, throwing log after log into the flames, burning through 12 full cords of heavy timber over 4 months. They had chopped wood until their shoulders bled, sacrificed endless hours of back-breaking labor to feed the hearth, and yet his father had still slept under 5 layers of wool blankets, with frost forming on his mustache before dawn. They were spending half their lives cutting fuel to power a machine that sucked cold air directly into their living space. Arthur placed his hand against the pine log wall beside the hearth. It was ice cold. The heat from the fire radiated outward, hit the thick logs, and moved straight through the timber into the freezing night air outside. The cabin was bleeding thermal energy in every direction. He stepped outside into the crisp morning air and looked out toward the timberline of the Deer Lodge Range. He knew what the coming winter would bring. The old-timers at the local trading post were already predicting a dark, brutal season. The pelts on the mountain beavers were twice as thick as usual, and the migratory geese had flown south 3 weeks early. If he stayed in this cabin, built the way every other cabin was built, he would burn another 12 cords of wood, wear himself to the bone, and risk his own health every night the thermometer plunged. Arthur made a quiet, unshakable vow right there in the frostbitten yard. He was not going to build a bigger fire. He was not going to chop 15 cords of wood and pray for a mild winter. He was going to build a completely new kind of cabin, one designed around a central heat battery that would capture every single thermal unit his fire produced, store it in solid rock, and radiate it gently into his home for hours after the last flame went out. He was going to stop fighting the laws of physics and start using them to keep his family alive. The work began 3 days later at Cottonwood Creek, a freezing mountain stream 3 miles south of the Vance homestead. While every other rancher in the valley was busy sharpening crosscut saws and hauling pine logs out of the high timber to stack their winter wood piles, Arthur Vance was standing hip-deep in icy water, levering massive boulders of dark river granite and dense basalt out of the mud. He was looking for a very specific type of stone. He did not want porous volcanic rock or soft shale, which trapped air pockets and crumbled under thermal stress. He needed high-density riverstone rocks that had been tumbled, compressed, and smoothed by thousands of years of rushing mountain water until they were almost as dense as solid iron. Dense stone has a high volumetric heat capacity, meaning it can absorb an immense amount of thermal energy without breaking apart. Holding onto that heat like a sponge holds water. The physical labor was punishing. Arthur worked alone from first light until the sun dipped behind the western peaks, using a heavy iron crowbar to pry 200-pound boulders out of the frozen riverbed. His hands were raw, cracked, and caked with gray mud that froze to his skin. His leather boots were stiff with ice every afternoon, and his lower back throbbed with a dull, relentless ache. To haul the rock back to his building site, he improvised a heavy timber sled pulled by a team of draft horses. Each load carried nearly a ton of stone, the wooden runners groaning and popping as the horses strained against the steep, rutted trail. On the 4th day of hauling, a rear axle on his wagon snapped under the weight of a massive, flat basalt slab, dumping 3,000 pounds of rock into the frozen mud and nearly crushing Arthur's left leg against a pine stump. He sat on a frozen log in the fading light, his knuckles bleeding through his canvas work gloves, exhaling heavy plumes of steam as he stared at the spilt load. His body screamed for him to stop, to give up this strange project, and just build a standard log cabin like his father and grandfather had done before him. But then he remembered the sound of his father coughing in the dark, the desperate rattle in his lungs that no medicine could soothe, and he stood up, grabbed his iron lever, and went back to work. By the 2nd week of November, Arthur had accumulated a mountain of stone beside his foundation pit. 11 tons, 22,000 pounds of dense river rock, and dark basalt sandstone. It was more stone than any single builder in the county had ever gathered for a residential project. That was the morning his older brother, Eli Vance, rode up to the homestead on his bay gelding. Eli was 29, a practical, no-nonsense rancher who had taken over the management of the family's livestock after their father's death. Eli dismounted, walked over to the massive pile of river rock, and kicked a 200-pound granite boulder with the toe of his boot. Eli looked at his younger brother with a mixture of anger and genuine concern. He asked Arthur why he was wasting precious pre-winter weeks hauling mountains of river rock out of a freezing creek, when 3 miles of cattle fence were down along the northern pasture, and the family's winter cordwood pile was barely 2 feet high. He told Arthur that the entire valley was talking about the young Vance boy who had lost his mind and was spending his inheritance on a pile of river gravel. Arthur stood his ground. He explained to his brother that cutting 20 cords of wood to feed a wasteful, drafty open fireplace was the real waste of labor. He told Eli that if he built this stone battery correctly, he would only need a fraction of the firewood that the main ranch house consumed, and the cabin would stay warm through the dead of night without anyone having to wake up to tend a fire. Eli shook his head, calling it a foolish, lazy dreamer's fantasy. He told Arthur that stone was cold, that everyone in Montana knew rock pulled the freeze right out of the dirt, and that building a mountain of rock inside a living room was nothing more than a silly ranch idea that would leave him shivering in an icy cave when the real cold hit. Eli mounted his horse, warned Arthur that he would not haul him out if he froze his toes off in January, and rode away down the timber trail. Arthur did not yell back. He picked up his spade, stepped into the 4-foot-deep foundation pit he had hand-dug down to solid bedrock, and began leveling the dirt. He was going to anchor those 11 tons of stone directly to the bedrock of the earth, so that the massive weight would never settle or shift. Let the valley talk. Let his brother doubt him. The stone was on the site, the foundation was ready, and the true test of physics was about to begin. On the second Saturday of November, Arthur hitched his horse team to an empty flatbed wagon and drove into the town of Deer Lodge to purchase the specialized binding materials he needed to assemble his central stone tower. Cobb's trading post was the social and commercial heart of the valley. It was a sprawling, single-story building constructed of heavy Douglas fir logs, heated by two massive iron potbelly stoves that glowed dull red in the center of the room. On a cold Saturday morning, the trading post was packed with local ranchers, timber cutters, and homesteaders who gathered around the stoves to drink black coffee, swap livestock prices, and talk about the upcoming winter. When Arthur walked in, his clothes caked with dried river mud and clay, Hiram Cobb, the store owner, greeted him from behind the high oak counter. Arthur laid out a handwritten order list: 3 barrels of commercial refractory clay, 4 bags of crushed lime, 2 sacks of fine river sand, and several heavy iron reinforcement straps. Hiram Cobb read the list, raised an eyebrow, and asked what kind of strange mortar Arthur was planning to mix with refractory clay and crushed brick. Before Arthur could answer, a loud, booming voice carried from the back corner of the store near the potbelly stove. It belonged to Silas Thorne. Silas Thorne was 58 years old, a towering man with a thick gray beard and hands like leather spatulas. He was the undisputed master builder of the Deer Lodge Valley. Over 34 years, Silas had personally designed and constructed 22 log cabins, 3 churches, and the county courthouse. His word on construction matters was treated as gospel throughout the territory. If Silas Thorne said a building was solid, you could bank your life on it. If he said it was weak, no bank in Montana would lend you $1 to build it. Silas stepped forward, holding his mug of coffee, a wide, condescending smile playing on his face. He addressed the entire store, announcing that young Arthur Vance was in town buying special clay to build a giant monument of river rocks right in the middle of his living room floor. The crowd of ranchers and timber cutters chuckled. Otto Becker, an experienced Bavarian stonemason who had worked on precision stonemasonry in Europe before moving to Montana, leaned against a flour barrel and shook his head. Otto told Arthur in his thick German accent that stone was a thermal conductor, not an insulator. He explained that if you put 11 tons of cold rock inside a house, that rock would absorb the ambient temperature of the frozen ground beneath it and act like a giant block of mountain ice sitting in the center of your cabin. Silas Thorne stepped closer to Arthur, tapping a thick finger against Arthur's chest. He told the young man that frontier fireplaces had been placed on exterior walls for 3 generations for a reason. An exterior wall allowed the chimney to vent smoke quickly out of the house without filling the room with soot. It saved floor space, and it kept the messy ash and fire hazard against the outer logs where it belonged. Silas declared that putting a giant pile of rocks in the center of a cabin was not engineering. It was just a silly ranch idea, from a boy who had spent too much time reading Eastern books and not enough time wielding a broadaxe. The men in the store laughed openly now. Hiram Cobb leaned over the counter and asked Arthur if he really thought he knew more about building winter shelters than Silas Thorne, who had been building cabins in this valley since before Arthur was born. Arthur Vance did not get flustered. He did not raise his voice or offer an angry defense. Instead, he pulled a neatly folded sheet of drafting paper from his coat pocket and laid it flat on the wooden counter beside the ledger. He calmly pointed to his hand-drawn diagrams and explained the basic physics of thermal mass. He told the gathered crowd that an open fireplace on an exterior wall loses 80% of its heat directly through the back of the chimney into the cold outdoor air. He explained that a central stone core, insulated from the ground by a gravel bed and surrounded by interior air, captures that escaping heat and stores it within the stone mass. He showed them his calculations, proving that 11 tons of river granite could absorb over 75,000 British thermal units of heat during a short, intense burn, and release that heat slowly over 12 to 16 hours. Silas Thorne glanced at the numbers on the paper, let out a dismissive snort, and told Arthur that cold winter winds did not care about numbers written on paper. Silas predicted that by Christmas, the stone tower would pull all the heat out of Arthur's stove, the flue would clog with soot because of the strange winding channels, and Arthur would come crawling back to his brother's ranch to keep his toes from freezing off. Arthur folded his paper, placed it carefully back in his pocket, and asked Hiram Cobb to load the refractory clay onto his wagon. He paid his bill in silence, stepped out into the freezing wind, and drove his wagon back toward the mountain. He did not need the approval of Silas Thorne or the men at the trading post. He only needed the laws of nature to remain consistent when the Arctic cold finally arrived. By the third week of November, the foundation pit was complete, and Arthur began the delicate, precise process of constructing the internal firebox, the combustion engine that would power his entire thermal battery. This was where most amateur builders who attempted masonry stoves failed catastrophically. Standard mortar mixed from basic field soil, lime, and water works fine for exterior stone walls where temperatures remain relatively stable. But inside a high-temperature firebox, standard mortar is a recipe for disaster. When wood burns at high intensity, the internal surfaces of the firebox can reach temperatures exceeding 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. Standard mortar contains microscopic moisture and mineral compounds that expand rapidly under that level of heat, causing the joints to crack, crumble, and blow out within weeks. Once the mortar joints fail, dangerous carbon monoxide and stray sparks can leak through the stone wall into the living space. To prevent this, Arthur mixed a custom refractory binder using a meticulous 3-to-1 ratio, 3 parts finely sifted blue clay, harvested from the deep bank of Cottonwood Creek, 1 part sharp, washed river sand, and a portion of crushed fire brick dust he had purchased at the trading post. This custom clay mortar had an exceptionally low coefficient of thermal expansion, meaning it could expand and contract repeatedly under intense heat without losing its structural bond or developing hairline fractures. Next came the sizing of the firebox itself. Traditional frontier fireplaces were built with massive, wide openings, often 4 feet wide and 3 feet high. Builders thought bigger openings meant more heat output, but Arthur's engineering manuals proved the exact opposite. A large, open firebox draws in far too much excess cold air from the room. That cold air dilutes the combustion gases, cooling the flame down to a sluggish 800 degrees Fahrenheit. At 800 degrees, wood does not burn completely. It produces heavy black smoke, leaves behind large amounts of unburned charcoal, and coats the inside of the chimney with sticky, highly flammable creosote. Arthur engineered his firebox with a tight, highly restricted opening, measuring just 2 feet wide by 2.5 feet high, a total cross-sectional opening of only 5 square feet. The physics behind this restricted design were brilliant, yet simple. By limiting the volume of air that could enter the firebox, Arthur created a controlled combustion chamber. The air entering through an adjustable iron draft vent at the base was forced to accelerate as it entered the tight space. This high-velocity airstream fed the flames with oxygen at a high rate, causing the fire to burn with intense, roaring efficiency. Within 20 minutes of ignition, the internal temperature of Arthur's firebox jumped from room temperature to a blistering 1500 degrees Fahrenheit. At 1500 degrees, thermal degradation occurs at a microscopic level. The complex hydrocarbon compounds in the pine and fir wood are broken down completely. The volatile gases that normally escape up a traditional chimney as thick black smoke were completely consumed by the heat. The fire burned with a clean, bright white-yellow flame that produced zero visible smoke at the chimney top and left behind nothing but a fine, powdery white ash. Every single heat unit locked inside the wood fiber was released into the chamber. There was no wasted fuel, no heavy soot, and no creosote buildup to threaten a chimney fire. Arthur had created a super-efficient combustion engine out of simple river stone, clay, and iron. If the firebox was the engine of Arthur's system, the internal flue structure was the energy harvester. In a conventional cabin fireplace, the superheated gases from the fire travel straight up a short, vertical masonry chute and exit the roof into the atmosphere. The hot gas spends less than 2 seconds inside the structure before escaping. As a result, up to 85% of the heat energy generated by the wood fire flies straight out the chimney, warming the open sky while the cabin below remains freezing. Arthur was determined to capture every bit of that heat before letting the exhaust gas leave his house. To do that, he constructed an internal 38-foot serpentine flue labyrinth inside his 11-ton stone core. Instead of venting straight up, the hot combustion gases exiting the firebox were forced into a structured maze of interconnected vertical and horizontal channels built entirely within the core of the sandstone tower. The gases traveled upward 4 feet, were deflected horizontally through a narrow baffle channel, descended 3 feet through a secondary chamber, looped beneath a solid granite divider, and then rose again through a third vertical channel before reaching the final exit flue near the roofline. As the 1,500-degree gas traveled through this 38-foot labyrinth, it was forced into continuous, direct contact with the interior surfaces of the sandstone and river granite. Through the process of thermal conduction, the dense stone eagerly absorbed the heat from the moving airstream. The temperature exchange was astonishing. By the time the exhaust gas completed its winding 38-foot journey through the stone core and reached the outer chimney cap at the roof, its temperature had dropped from 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit down to just 140 degrees. 85% of the thermal energy generated by the fire had been stripped out of the airstream and transferred directly into the 22,000 pounds of stone sitting in the center of the room. To ensure the complex flue path did not choke the draft and cause smoke to back up into the cabin, Arthur applied fluid dynamics and Bernoulli's principle to his flue design. He knew that as air cools, it becomes denser and heavier, which naturally slows down its upward movement and creates resistance. To overcome this friction, Arthur gradually narrowed the width of the flue channels as they progressed upward through the stone tower. By reducing the cross-sectional area of the upper channels, he forced the cooling exhaust gas to accelerate as it approached the exit, maintaining a steady, powerful upward draft that pulled fresh air cleanly through the firebox without allowing a single wisp of smoke to spill into the living space. Arthur spent 4 exhausting days laying the internal baffles, using a small brass plumb line and a wooden straightedge to ensure that every channel wall was perfectly smooth. Any rough edge or misaligned stone would create air turbulence, slowing down the draft and allowing soot to accumulate in the corners. He scraped every interior mortar joint smooth with a rounded trowel until the inside of the labyrinth resembled a polished stone pipe. When he placed his hand near the exit vent at the top of the tower during a test burn, he could feel a strong, steady pull of air drawing through the entire 38-foot path. The draft was smooth, silent, and self-sustaining. The heat battery was not just storing energy, it was breathing with mechanical precision. By the middle of December, the outer log walls of the 22 by 26-foot cabin were fully notched, chinked, and roofed over with heavy pine rafters and split cedar shingles. Standing dead center in the single main room was Arthur's completed creation, an 8-foot-tall, 5-foot-wide rectangular tower of dark river granite and warm red sandstone, gleaming under a hand-rubbed coat of clear linseed oil. It was a massive, imposing structure that occupied nearly 60 square feet of central floor space. To a conventional builder, sacrificing that much interior real estate in a small cabin seemed insane. But Arthur's spatial layout was deeply organized. His older brother, Eli, arrived unannounced on a cold Tuesday afternoon, stepping through the heavy timber door to inspect the progress. Eli stood in the center of the room, looking at the massive stone tower that dominated the cabin. He shook his head, pointing out that Arthur had built a giant stone wall right in the middle of his house, cutting the room in half and leaving barely enough space for a small dining table and a workbench along the outer walls. Arthur did not answer with words. He pointed up toward the heavy timber ladder that led to the sleeping loft above. He asked Eli to climb up. Eli grumbled, placed his boots on the rungs, and climbed into the upper loft area. In a standard cabin, sleeping lofts were miserable places in winter. Because hot air rises rapidly and escapes through uninsulated roof boards, lofts were either stiflingly smoky when the fire was roaring or freezing cold 2 hours later when the fire died. But Arthur had designed the upper 4 feet of his stone tower to pass directly through the floorboards of the sleeping loft, continuing up toward the roofline. The massive stone core stood right in the center of the sleeping space, radiating gentle, steady heat in every direction. The floorboards around the stone were warm to the touch. Air heated by the lower section of the tower rose naturally through open wooden grates in the loft floor, creating a slow, continuous convection loop that warmed the upper level without needing a separate stove or fireplace. Eli kneeled on the loft floor, placed his palm flat against the sandstone block, and felt the steady, gentle warmth radiating from the stone. He looked down at his younger brother standing below, his stubborn skepticism showing its first tiny crack. He admitted the loft felt comfortable, but he immediately reminded Arthur that they had not seen a real Montana cold snap yet. A mild December afternoon was one thing. A 50-degree, below-zero January gale was something else entirely. Later that week, as the autumn weather began to give way to true winter, Arthur initiated the essential charging process for his 11-ton thermal battery. A massive stone core cannot be brought to working temperature instantly. If you build a roaring, maximum-intensity fire inside a cold, damp 11-ton stone structure, the extreme temperature difference between the interior firebox and the icy exterior stone will cause rapid, uneven expansion, cracking the masonry joints, and damaging the core. Arthur began with small, controlled curing fires, burning just 3 or 4 thin sticks of dry pine at a time, twice a day for 3 consecutive days. The gentle heat slowly drove out the remaining moisture, locked deep within the refractory clay mortar joints. On the 4th day, he increased the fuel load, burning 2 moderate fires of dry fir logs. By the evening of the 6th day, the 11 tons of stone had absorbed heat throughout its entire volume. The outer surface of the tower reached a uniform, comfortable temperature of 110 degrees Fahrenheit. When you stood anywhere within 8 feet of the tower, you could feel a soft, enveloping wall of radiant energy pushing outward against your skin, like standing near a sun-warmed stone wall on a quiet July evening. From the outside, however, the process looked completely different to the surrounding valley. Because Arthur kept small fires burning continuously for 3 days to charge the mass, a thin, steady trail of pale gray smoke rose from his central chimney day and night. Ranchers driving their supply wagons along the valley road saw the continuous smoke and made their own assumptions. At the trading post, men chuckled and told each other that young Arthur Vance was already burning through his winter wood supply at a desperate rate, just to keep his strange stone house from turning into a block of ice. They believed his silly experiment was already failing, and that he would run out of firewood before the new year even arrived. Arthur saw them passing on the road, saw them pointing at his smoking chimney, and quietly shut his heavy oak door, stepping back into a room that held a steady, motionless 70 degrees. The weather pattern that shattered the tranquility of Deer Lodge Valley arrived on the afternoon of January 10th, 1895. It was not a typical winter storm. Climatologists would later record it as one of the most intense polar vortex invasions in the recorded history of the American West. A massive high-pressure system stalled over northern Alberta, locking a deep reservoir of Arctic air into place, before driving it straight south down the corridor of the Rocky Mountains like a frozen battering ram. The barometric pressure dropped faster than any old-timer in the valley could remember. At noon on January 10th, the temperature at Cobb's trading post stood at a manageable 14 degrees above zero. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it had plunged to 8 below. By 8 o'clock that evening, the mercury read 22 below zero, and a screaming 35-mile-per-hour wind swept down from the Continental Divide, driving fine, crystalline snow horizontally across the valley floor. The sound of the wilderness changing was terrifying. In the dense pine forests surrounding Cottonwood Creek, the sudden, extreme drop in temperature caused the moisture inside the living trunks of the lodgepole pines to freeze solid and expand instantaneously. Throughout the night, the forest echoed with loud, explosive cracks that sounded like heavy rifle fire, as century-old trees split wide open from the internal pressure of their own frozen sap. By the morning of January 12th, The wind had increased to a sustained 45 miles per hour, with gusts pushing past 60. The snow was no longer falling from the sky in soft flakes. It was being scoured off the frozen earth and whipped into a blinding, whiteout desert that reduced visibility to less than 3 feet. If a man stepped 10 yards away from his doorway, without a guide rope tied to his waist, he would lose his bearings within 20 seconds, wander into the white void, and freeze to death within 40 feet of his own front porch. Every conventional home in the valley became an immediate battleground for survival. The extreme cold tested every log wall, every chink seam, and every fireplace design in Deer Lodge Valley. Homes that had felt cozy and adequate during the mild weeks of November were suddenly exposed as fragile, drafty wooden boxes, completely incapable of holding back an Arctic gale. Across the valley, ranchers and homesteaders worked themselves to the point of physical collapse, just trying to keep their hearth fires burning. But the harder the Arctic wind blew against the exterior walls, the faster the stack effect pulled cold air through the chinking gaps, turning the interior of almost every cabin into a freezing wind tunnel. The battle between human endurance and sub-zero nature had begun, and the frontier traditionalists were losing ground by the hour. Inside the home of Silas Thorne, the master builder who had mocked Arthur at the trading post, conditions had descended into a nightmare of smoke and freezing cold. Silas had built his own cabin 20 years earlier. It was a large, handsome structure, constructed from thick, hand-hewn Douglas fir logs, featuring a magnificent, 5-foot-wide stone fireplace set into the western exterior wall. Silas had always taken immense pride in that fireplace. It was his masterpiece. But on the night of January 12th, with the outside temperature hovering at 28 below zero and 40-mile-per-hour winds battering his western wall, Silas's masterpiece turned into a violent cold air pump. To combat the terrifying chill creeping through the floorboards, Silas built a massive, roaring fire in his 5-foot hearth, throwing 3 thick oak logs onto the grate every 30 minutes. The fire roared like a freight train, sending superheated air rushing up the broad chimney flue. But as that hot air blasted out the roof, it created a severe negative pressure zone inside the cabin. The house began to suck outside air through every microscopic seam in its construction. Freezing Arctic air poured in around the window sashes, under the thick oak door, and through tiny hairline cracks in the mud chinking between the wall logs. Silas stood 3 feet from his hearth, his front soaking up intense, scorching heat that singed the wool of his trousers, while his back was chilled by a whistling draft of sub-zero air cutting across the floorboards. 5 feet away from the fireplace, a tin bucket of well water sitting on the kitchen table froze solid, forming an inch-thick crust of ice over its surface, while a 6-foot fire was actively roaring on the hearth. His wife and 2 daughters sat on a bench directly in front of the fire, wrapped in 5 layers of heavy wool quilts, their eyes red and water-stained from the thick wood smoke that swept back into the room every time a gust of wind hit the top of the exterior chimney. By 2 o'clock in the morning, Silas had burned through his entire indoor wood box and was forced to open his door, step into the screaming blizzard, and fight his way through 4-foot drifts to his outdoor woodshed. What he found in the woodshed made his heart sink. A warm afternoon thaw 3 weeks earlier had melted snow onto his cordwood stack, and the subsequent freeze had turned his carefully split pine logs into a single, fused mountain of solid ice. He spent 45 exhausting minutes in 28 below zero wind, using a heavy iron splitting maul to hack away chunks of ice-encrusted timber, his fingers growing numb, despite his double-lined leather mittens. When he finally dragged the wet, icy logs back inside and threw them into the fireplace, the wood hissed, sputtered, and poured thick, acrid gray smoke into the living room, dropping the fire's temperature by half. His family sat coughing in the dim, smoky room as the interior temperature dropped to 31 degrees Fahrenheit. The crisis was repeated in almost every homestead across Deer Lodge Valley. At the ranch of Jacob Puit, 2 miles north, the family ran out of dry firewood entirely on the 3rd day of the storm. In sheer desperation, Jacob took an axe to his own pine dining table, chopping up the chairs, 2 wooden storage chests, and 6 lengths of cedar fence rail, just to keep a flame alive in his hearth through the night. His children slept in their heavy winter coats, sheepskin boots, and wool caps, huddled together under a mountain of blankets, crying softly from the cold that refused to leave the room. At Hiram Cobb's trading post, the two massive pot-belly stoves burned red-hot, but the drafty, high-ceilinged store could not hold the heat. The ink froze solid inside the glass bottles on Hiram's counter, and the merchant was forced to move his bed into the back pantry, sealing the door with felt strips to survive the night. The traditional methods, the wide-open fireplaces, the thin exterior chimneys, the reliance on endless, active wood-burning, had completely broken down under the weight of a true Arctic cold snap. The valley was burning through its resources at an unsustainable rate, its people exhausted, freezing, and trapped inside shelters that offered only the illusion of protection. The peak of the Arctic invasion arrived in the dark hours before dawn on Monday, January 14th, 1895. The gale-force winds finally died down to a bitter, motionless whisper, leaving the sky impossibly clear, dark, and filled with millions of hard, glittering stars. Without cloud cover or wind to mix the atmospheric layers, radiational cooling accelerated at a terrifying rate. The heavy cold air settled into the low bottomlands of Deer Lodge Valley like a lake of liquid ice. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the official brass thermometer mounted on the north wall of Cobb's trading post registered a staggering 36 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. 3 miles away, inside Arthur Vance's cabin, there was total, serene silence. No fire was burning in the central firebox. The last small load of dry fir logs had burned down to a pile of soft, glowing embers at 9 o'clock the previous evening, over 9 hours ago. Arthur woke up in his sleeping loft, stretched his arms, and pushed back his lightweight wool blanket. He was wearing a simple, single-layer cotton work shirt and cotton trousers. He felt completely, perfectly comfortable. There was no frost on his blanket, no ice on his breath, and no draft whistling through the floorboards. He climbed down the timber ladder into the main room, walked over to the north wall, the furthest exterior point from the central stone core, and looked at the spirit thermometer he had hung on a brass nail. The red liquid column sat motionless at 63 degrees Fahrenheit. Think about that metric for a moment. Outside, the world was locked in a killing 36 degree below zero deep freeze. Yet inside Arthur's living room, without an active fire burning for nearly 10 hours, the temperature was a steady, comfortable, draft-free 63 degrees, a thermal differential of 99 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained purely through passive storage and natural physics. Arthur walked over to the central sandstone tower and placed his bare hand against the rock face. The stone was warm, a steady, comforting 105 degrees Fahrenheit across its entire surface. For 9 hours, while the wilderness outside plunged to historic depths of cold, those 11 tons of river granite and basalt had been quietly, continuously performing their engineered function. The mass was slowly releasing the 75,000 British thermal units of energy it had absorbed during the previous evening's burn, radiating soft infrared warmth outward in 360 degrees through the air, warming the log walls, the floorboards, the furniture, and the air itself without creating a single draft. Arthur opened the iron draft vent at the base of the firebox, placed 5 small split sticks of dry pine onto the hot ash bed, and struck a single match. Because the internal 38-foot flue labyrinth was still warm from the day before, the air inside the channels was light and buoyant. The draft pulled immediately, sucking the flame into the kindling with a soft, hungry whistle. Within 15 minutes, the compact firebox was roaring at 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit, completely smokeless and clean. Within 20 minutes, the living room temperature climbed smoothly from 63 degrees up to 72 degrees. Arthur looked at his wood log box beside the hearth. During the entire 4 days of the historic Arctic blizzard, while his neighbors were burning 40 to 50 heavy logs a day and destroying their furniture for fuel, Arthur had burned a grand total of 14 logs per 24-hour period, less than 1/3 of a cord for the entire week. His firewood supply in the shed outside was virtually untouched. His cabin was pristine, dry, warm, and draft-free. His air was clean and free of wood smoke. The 11-ton stone core had not been a giant glacier inside the house. as Silas Thorne had predicted. It was an unbreakable, self-sustaining heat shield that had turned the worst Arctic blizzard in 40 years into a mild, comfortable winter morning. Arthur poured himself a cup of fresh water from the tin pitcher, sitting on his kitchen table water that was completely liquid, clear, and ready to drink, and sat down by the warm sandstone wall to watch the sunrise over the frozen peaks of the Continental Divide. At 10 o'clock that morning, 3 dark figures appeared on the snow-crusted ridge overlooking Arthur's cabin. They were moving slowly, struggling through waist-deep drifts, wrapped in heavy furs and wool scarves. It was Silas Thorne, Eli Vance, and Otto Becker. They had spent 2 days trapped in Silas's smoky, freezing cabin, burning through the master builder's remaining woodpile and watching his family suffer in 30-degree indoor temperatures. As soon as the wind died down that morning, Eli had insisted they trek across the valley to check on his younger brother. Eli was genuinely terrified of what they would find. He fully expected to find Arthur unconscious or severely frostbitten inside an icy, smoke-choked cabin. Silas Thorne had come along because he felt a heavy, crushing weight of responsibility. If the boy had frozen to death in that strange stone bunker, Silas knew the valley would blame him for not stopping the project when he had the chance. As they neared the cabin, Silas stopped in his tracks and pointed toward the roofline. There was no thick, billowing cloud of black smoke pouring from Arthur's chimney. There was only a thin, barely visible shimmer of clear, hot air rising into the cold sky, the distinct signature of an ultra-high temperature, complete combustion burn. Eli reached the heavy oak door first, his hands shaking inside his mitts, and knocked hard against the timber 3 times. The door swung inward immediately. Arthur Vance stood in the doorway, smiling warmly, wearing a cotton-work shirt with his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. "Step inside, gentlemen," Arthur said, stepping back into the room. "You look like you could use some warmth." Silas Thorne, Eli Vance, and Otto Becker stepped across the threshold, and as the heavy oak door shut behind them, all 3 men froze in place. It was like stepping out of an Arctic tundra and walking directly into a greenhouse in middle June. A dense, enveloping wave of soft, dry, radiant heat embraced them immediately. It did not feel like the harsh, scorching heat of a potbelly stove that singed your eyebrows while your feet froze on the floorboards. It was a gentle, uniform warmth that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the air, from the pine floorboards under their boots, from the log walls, and from the massive, dark stone tower standing in the center of the room. Silas Thorne stared at Arthur in complete disbelief. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the scene. There were no coats hanging on the chairs, no blankets draped over shoulders. On the kitchen table, a small dish of butter sat soft and yellow, and a tray of bread dough was rising cleanly under a cloth near the stone core. Silas pulled a small, silver-framed spirit thermometer from his thick fur coat, the same calibrated instrument he used to check foundation mortar curing temperatures, and held it out in his trembling hand. He watched the red liquid column climb rapidly. 40 degrees, 50 degrees, 60 degrees, settling squarely at 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Silas walked around the room like a man in a dream, holding the thermometer out at arm's length. He checked the north wall corner. 62 degrees. He checked the floorboards near the door. 62 degrees. He checked the ladder leading to the sleeping loft. 64 degrees. Across 8 distinct locations in the house, the total temperature variance was less than 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Then, Silas turned and looked at his own memory of 4 hours ago. At dawn, inside Silas Thorne's expertly built, traditional cabin with a roaring 6-foot fire, actively burning on an exterior hearth. His indoor thermometer had registered exactly 31 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside Arthur Vance's cabin with no fire burning for over 9 hours, the temperature sat at 63 degrees Fahrenheit. Arthur's cabin was exactly 32 degrees warmer than the best conventional house in the valley. Otto Becker, the veteran German stonemason, walked slowly over to the sandstone core. He removed his thick leather glove, hesitated for a second, and then pressed his bare palm flat against the stone block 6 feet from the firebox. The rock was a steady, warm 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Otto held his hand there for a long moment, feeling the deep thermal energy stored within the dense granite mass. Mein Gott, Otto whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. It's not a chimney. It's a furnace that never stops. Silas Thorne stood in the center of the room, looking at the young man he had publicly ridiculed at Cobb's trading post 2 months earlier. The master builder, who had spent 40 years building cabins the traditional way, looked down at his own thermometer, then at the warm stone tower, and finally at Arthur Vance. Silas reached out his large, calloused hand, took Arthur's hand in a firm grip, and looked him straight in the eye. "Arthur," Silas said, his voice loud enough for Eli and Otto to hear clearly, "I stood in front of the whole town and called you a fool. I told everyone your idea was silly and dangerous. I was wrong. I was completely, utterly wrong. You have built the smartest, most efficient house in the territory, and I am humble enough to admit that I need to learn from you." Eli Vance walked over to his younger brother, placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder, and looked at the stone tower with tears welling in his eyes. He thought of their father, of the long nights spent shivering in the old log cabin, and he knew that their family's struggle against the Montana winter had finally been won. If this story has shown you the power of challenging conventional wisdom, show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more historical survival engineering stories every week. By Thursday afternoon, the news of Arthur Vance's 63-degree cabin had swept through Deer Lodge Valley like a prairie fire. The story was no longer about a strange ranch boy with a silly idea. It was about survival, economy, and the realization that the traditional ways of building had cost the valley decades of unnecessary suffering and wasted wood. Dozens of homesteaders, ranchers, and timber cutters made the trek to Arthur's homestead. They came to stand in his living room, to touch the warm river stone, and to look at the hand-drawn blueprints pinned to his workbench. Arthur turned his cabin into an open classroom, taking time to explain every single detail to anyone who asked. He showed them the refractory clay binder mixture, the 5-square-foot firebox opening, the 1,500-degree combustion mechanics, and the internal 38-foot serpentine flue path. On Friday morning, a pair of wooden sleds arrived at Arthur's yard, carrying an unexpected visitor. Elder Standing Bear, an 82-year-old respected leader of the local Shoshone Nation, accompanied by his grandson who served as his translator. Standing Bear walked slowly into the cabin, leaning on a carved wooden staff. He walked directly to the central stone tower, placed both hands against the sandstone face, and closed his eyes for a long moment, feeling the deep, steady warmth radiating from the rock. A soft smile broke across the old man's weathered face. He turned to Arthur and spoke in his native tongue, his grandson translating the words into English. Standing Bear said that hundreds of winters ago, before the white men brought axes and built rectangular log boxes, the Shoshone people built winter earth lodges called pit houses. They dug 4 feet into the earth, built a central ring of heavy river rocks around a small, controlled fire pit, and allowed the earth walls and rocks to hold the heat through the Arctic night. He told Arthur that the young man had not invented something new. He had remembered something ancient and true. He had listened to the voice of the earth and the rock instead of the loud assertions of proud men. Standing Bear reached out, placed his hand on Arthur's forehead, and gave the young man his blessing, declaring that Arthur's house was a place of true wisdom where life would always be protected from the cold. The visit deeply moved everyone present. It showed the valley that natural physics and thermal laws transcend cultures and eras. What the Russian engineers had written in technical papers, and what the Shoshone elders had practiced for centuries, were the exact same physical truths, expressed through different tools. The transformation of Deer Lodge Valley began that very afternoon. Silas Thorne and Otto Becker did not let their pride stand in the way of progress. They sat down with Arthur at his kitchen table, laid out blank drafting paper, and asked Arthur to help them re-engineer their building methods. Together, they drafted standardized plans for central thermal mass cores that could be retrofitted into existing cabins or built into new homesteads. Silas publicly announced at the trading post that his construction company would no longer build traditional exterior wall fireplaces. From that day forward, every cabin built by Thorne and Vance Construction would feature a central, high-mass thermal battery core. Over the next 18 months, 26 homes in Deer Lodge Valley were built or retrofitted with Arthur's central stone heating design. The economic impact on the community was immediate and profound. Average household firewood consumption across the adapting farms dropped by more than 60%. Families that used to spend all autumn cutting 12 cords of timber now needed only 4. The endless cycle of winter fuel panic came to an end. Children no longer slept in coats. Respiratory illnesses dropped sharply across the valley, and homesteaders who used to spend their winter days in an exhausting struggle against drafty cold had time to focus on improving their livestock, building better barns, and growing their farms. A single young man's decision to trust natural physics over rigid tradition had changed the entire culture of the frontier. Word of the Deer Lodge Valley thermal mass cabins spread far beyond the borders of Montana Territory. By the winter of 1897, technical summaries of Arthur Vance's hand-drawn blueprints were published in regional agricultural extension bulletins and mining journals across Idaho, Wyoming, and Colorado. In the high-altitude mining camps of the Rocky Mountains, where wood was scarce, expensive, and difficult to transport up steep mountain trails, bunkhouses built with central thermal cores allowed mining operations to stay open through sub-zero winter months at a fraction of their previous heating costs. Arthur's older brother, Eli Vance, built a beautiful 5-room timber home on the main ranch in 1898, designed entirely around a massive, central basalt and granite core that Arthur personally helped him construct. The Vance family ranch prospered for generations, becoming a beacon of agricultural innovation, comfort, and hospitality in western Montana. Arthur Vance lived his entire, long, productive life in the 22 by 26-foot log cabin he had constructed in 1894. He married, raised 3 children, and watched his grandchildren play on the warm pine floorboards around that central stone tower. On winter evenings, while 60-mile-per-hour winds howled down from the Continental Divide, the Vance family sat together in shirt sleeves, reading books and sharing meals in a room that held a motionless, quiet 70 degrees, powered by a single small fire, burned 14 hours earlier. Arthur Vance never claimed to be a genius or a hero. He was simply a son who refused to let cold claim another life he loved, trusting the quiet truth of natural physics over the loud assertions of tradition. In doing so, he restored his family's honor, warmed a freezing valley, and proved that true courage lies in asking why things are done, rather than blindly repeating them. Word of the silly ranch idea spread across 4 territories, transforming frontier architecture and saving countless homesteaders from the terrifying grip of sub-zero winters. The central stone core became a symbol of what happens when human ingenuity listens to the earth, turning simple river rock into an unbreakable shield against the wilderness. Today, that original sandstone tower still stands in Deer Lodge Valley, silent and strong inside a restored ranch house. It remains a timeless monument to a young man's faith in physical law, reminding us that true warmth isn't built by burning bigger fires, but by building deeper wisdom. Educational note: this story presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific dramatized dialogue events are fictionalized, while the technical concepts, thermal mass physics, refractory masonry principles, and thermodynamic laws discussed are based on real historical building practices and well-established physical science. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current building codes, safety guidelines, and professional engineering standards,